Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I know you're all anxious to get into this. For 20 years or more, Michael Suarez has been educating and inspiring people with his deep thinking into disparate and varied aspects of the history of the book. Indeed, a mere recitation of the titles of his many books, articles, lectures, and journal contributions would make an interesting lecture in itself and would probably consume the better part of an hour. He's a man of seemingly limitless energy and boundless inquiry. In this dynamic, chaotic era, when our trade is changing faster than ever before and the very idea of the book seems alternately doomed to extinction or on the verge of rebirth in hitherto unimagined forms, we desperately need new ways of understanding where we've been, where we are presently, and where we are bound. In this context, the work and thought of a man like Michael Suarez become particularly important. Anyone who can talk about ecosystems and the book trade in the same sentence has my full attention, and I hope he will have yours. Michael.
Let me begin by saying thank you for coming. I'm violating a cardinal principle of mine by standing before you right now, and that is simply this. For many years, I ran a doctoral seminar in bibliography at Oxford University, and I would keep saying, why are we talking about this? Let's go into the Bodleian Library and do this. Well, here we are with all those books just over there. And a little bit of me says, why are we talking about this? Let's go in there and do this. But I suppose we can wait a little bit and think. I'd like to think today. This isn't a kind of a powerful piece of research that I'd like to present to you. This isn't some kind of arcane finding. I haven't found more Archimedes, hiding in a manuscript. It's more that I'm trying to find ways to think about book history, and particularly I'm trying to find ways to think productively and capaciously about how we include the antiquarian market into our book historical researches. Because generally speaking, we haven't done this. And this seems to me very strange because other than coins, if we look from late antiquity to the present, other than coins, books and manuscripts are the artifacts most commonly left by human civilizations. So that makes books very, very important, it seems to me, important as objects as well as important for what they record, because nobody's making any more of them. There are no more incunables being made, last time I checked. And it seems to me that as we think about book history, we want to think about the antiquarian trade because books have a privileged place in our society. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, I think. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the picture that launched 1,000 ships. This is Robert Darnton's diagram of the communications circuit in an article that came out first in Daedalus in the early 1980s. An article called, What is the History of Books? And in many ways, Bob Darnton, along with Roger Chartier and D.F. Mackenzie, at least in the Anglo-American world, can be in many ways accounted the progenitors of the discipline we might call book history. And this diagram has kind of been standard fare in thinking about how books pass through the market for the last 20-odd years. So we have an author-publisher relationship that then gets mediated by printers, compositors, pressmen, and shippers, and so on and so forth, booksellers, readers, and then there's some kind of feedback loop to the author. And then, as a kind of brilliant fudge, we have the economic and social conjuncture, political and legal sanctions, intellectual influences, and publicity. So what we have is we have some kind of scattershot model here to say, well, these are the principal functions, as it were, and it's taking place in a broad social sphere. Adams and Barker, in critiquing this model, said, well, wait a minute, that's just people's jobs, and it's more than that. Instead of thinking about people's jobs, what if you thought about books themselves? You had the publication, manufacture, distribution, reception, survival, and then you have all these things. So they again, but again, this whole socioeconomic conjuncture. And some people see this as an improvement and some people not. It, to me, likewise, seems somewhat reductive. Now, so I come to this partly because my undergraduate training was in evolutionary and population biology. And I'm not going to do a heavy science thing on you today. I'm no longer capable of doing that. One of the saddest moments of my life was to go back and clean out my mother's basement and to read the papers I wrote in my senior year in college and to understand that the mathematical models I built were no longer intelligible to me. So there will be no complex mathematical modeling today. But it seems to me that even this is a little more complicated than what we were seeing earlier. And it seems to me that last time I studied evolutionary biology and carbon flows and all the rest, it was more like this. And so it seems to me very strange that we can do this, but when we're talking about the agents of the book trade, we're doing something much more primitive. Now, what I learned from this is the carbon flows going through an ecosystem. And what I learned about from the science of ecology and population biology is that it's all about the flow of materials. That ecosystems are all about the flow of materials. And we might say that an ecosystem of book history is all about the flow of books and money and information. We might therefore say that when we're thinking about book history as an ecosystem, that is to say a complex system, of which I'm going to take one tiny part today, we might think about it as the flow of value. Okay? So here's the application of ecosystem, which I only discovered after I put in the title for my talk. There are a lot of people who are using now, bringing back from the 70s, these ecosystem models to talk about, well, how do the new media function? So you see different models of doing this. I found about 25, and I decided to spare you them. You'll be pleased to know. This is not my work. This is the work of one of the best book historians in the world, James Raven. This appears in a book published in Italy, and it's not very accessible. But it seems to me here's a much more complex view already, a much more historically nuanced view of how the book works. And it's located, it has the virtue of being located in a particular time period. Again, I've prescinded from giving you all the diagrams that he provides. I think there are about 6 of them. I just want to show you 3 very briefly so that we can see Raven's work as a kind of model here. He's looking at the book trade in 1600, and you see he's talking about particular people, and he understands how these things work with much more nuance because he's not afraid of historical particularity. And it seems to me that when we try to talk about book history, and as we come back to the antiquarian trade, we have to immerse ourselves in historical particularity. As William Blake said, art and science together proceed by minute particulars. And so it seems to me that if we have no minute particulars, there's no point in doing this. So here's by the way, that was my mother who just walked out, just so you know. She always does that. So here you see a more complex view a century later. And here we see immediately we have the introduction of a kind of a country element and a privileging of the importance of importation, fairs figured earlier, and the colporteurs as well. I don't want to dwell on these except for to say that the introduction of auctions, which started in the 1680s in England, also had a profound effect. By the time we get into the beginning of the 19th century, we're really beginning to see something much more web-like. And this seems to me much more to do justice. This is, if you will, a kind of ecosystem rather than a mere sort of wire diagram, which seems to me historically very reductive, and I think we can do better than that. So when I think about the antiquarian trade and the flow of value, I start with the bookseller, the collector, the library, the scholar, teacher, and very, very briefly and extremely schematically. Think about if the book starts with the bookseller and goes to the collector, and as we'll see, almost inevitably, eventually, from the collector to the library. Then the scholar teacher is in the library who produces scholarly works, which are then used by the bookseller, often who's scholarly person himself. We're going to come to that in a second. This material is then used by the bookseller to add value for the collector. Remember, this is a circuit of value. And I realize this is extremely primitive. Bear with me. So the bookseller can sell directly to the library. He's adding value. The bookseller adds value for the collector. The collector adds value for the library by his donation. The scholar teacher adds value by his research and publishing, which is then in turn used. This is one way, one simple way of thinking about the antiquarian market. It doesn't always work this way. Duh. It doesn't always work this way. But it's one way of beginning to conceptualize how does this work and how are we to think about it. This is a more complex but still pretty simple. This is as complicated as we get in the diagrams because partly my ability with PowerPoint is deeply limited. But if we think about a cycle here between collectors and booksellers, and collectors are adding their own scholarship. Some of you will have been in Los Angeles last year when I spoke about book auction catalogs as works of scholarship. And I made, I hope, a powerful argument that these catalogs should be on a kind of a JSTOR, not just for the copy-specific information that they provide, but also because of their synthetic work and their original scholarship. But also collectors interpret the work, they contextualize the work. This seems extremely important to me. This is part of the adding of value. Collectors are conglomerating, they're bringing together works in association. But so are booksellers doing the same things as collectors. Eventually, almost everything ends up in a library. Some people think this is good, and some people think this is bad. But this is the condition that has to drive our understanding of the contemporary antiquarian trade. So, Loring Andrews said, the melancholy truth is that the book hunter's lot was never harder one than it is today. Things keep getting into public libraries, and the supply is limited, and now it's been virtually exhausted. The rarest of rare things today is a rare book of value and interest. And he said this in 1662. So what's that about? But what happens if we think about this lockbox? What happens when things keep getting tied up? If part of the premise is they're not making any more rare books, although, you know, Salman Rushdie's papers were just acquired by Emory for $1 million, that's pretty good, it seems to me. But if they're not really making any more rare books, and some people are collecting contemporary literature, of course, but then what's happening to the supply for the collecting market? And how do we understand that? So, Copernicus's De Revolutionibus. According to the Owen Gingrich census, 274 copies, of which 27 are in private hands. Last time I checked, that means that 90% are in institutions. The first folio, 10% in private hands. Okay, this radically changed during the 19th century, but 10% of copies in the first folio are in private hands. Something that may be heartening to booksellers and collectors is that in this century, the 21st century, there have been 9 sales of the first folio. And 7 of them, for sure, went from institutions into private hands. And 2 were not quite so sure, but I'm pretty sure. It's hard to know. The Gutenberg Bible, we believe that there are 180 copies printed. Not really sure, but we believe there are 180 copies printed. And we know that there are 2 or 3 of the approximately 80 left, sorry, of the 48 left, in private hands. It's hard to know how to classify the Bibliotheca Bodmeriana in Switzerland. Public, private, not really sure. But let's say there are 3 copies in private hands of the 48 known copies to exist. And of course, the Bay Psalm book, 11 known copies extant, all of them in institutions. If you're a collector, there's no such thing as the Bay Psalm book. Not to acquire anyway, not in its original, you're not going to do it. It's gone. So how do we understand the condition of scarcity in the market? Now, it's not gone if you're a scholar, it's not gone if you want to go study it, it's not gone even if you want to go look at it. If you probably give enough money to the right institution, they might even let you play with it. But it's gone if you want to acquire it. So the float, what's the antiquarian book market worth worldwide, more or less? What's the possible available valuation now? Probably about 400 to 500 million US dollars, more or less. The calculation, I hasten to add, is not mine. It's a ballpark calculation from somebody much more qualified than I am to talk about this, and that's Bill Rees. And when Bill Rees says something, I usually trust him. And I trust this figure as best as we can. So that's the market. And what does that mean? That means that compared to the market in 19th century paintings, not the whole art market, but just compared to the market in 19th century paintings, the antiquarian book market is tiny, right? Compared to the market in decorative arts, the antiquarian market is tiny. 500 million worldwide? What's that about? And again, that's partly because things have no value if they're not vendable. And they're not vendable for the most part. There are some exceptions with deaccessioning. They're not vendable if they're in libraries. They're not in the market. So they're not going to make any more books. We see this publishing explosion, but look how few books were published that survive. Most of these are in institutions. This is work I did from the English short title catalog for the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, Volume 5. Spent 4 years of my life, how stupid am I, doing a bibliometric analysis of the English short title catalog to try to understand the history of 18th century British publishing. It is true that it is being made into a movie, this bibliometric analysis. It begins with a helicopter chase. It's very, very exciting. Yeah, exactly. Denzel Washington plays me. Actually, yeah. But this is all there is in the 18th century in the whole of the British Isles. England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, this is all there is. And the overwhelming numbers of these books are in institutions. But this is tiny, tiny numbers. So, and then we come to a further problem. I don't think this is a problem. I don't think any of this is a problem. I think this is reality. We have to know how to deal with it. We want to understand it. But we come to a further problem. If we look here, we see that literature, classics, and belles-lettres comprise maybe about 10% of the publishing output, which is what many, many people collect. Government printing goes up, 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 up. Politics, government, and law. Religion during this 18th century goes down, down, down. Not many people are collecting religion. Not many people are collecting government printing. And yet, throughout the whole of the 18th century, which is the one I know best and the one that I can provide reliable figures for, that's about 50% of what survives. Now remember, what survives is skewed for all sorts of reasons. We're not saying what survives is what was printed. There are relationships that we can do. There are algorithms that we can create, but we're not going to do that today. But if 50% is religion and politics, and most people are collecting high spots, market of scarcity. So if we just look at some of the libraries and collections, we see the importance of donors. Again and again, collector donors are central to the establishment of the history of scholarship in the United States. University of Alabama, the David Walker Lupton African American Cookbook Collection. I love that. Okay. Kent State, the Show Print Collection, the True Crime Collection, sheet music, pulp fiction, intelligence, Arabic papyrus and paper, and so on. Each one of these was a passionate interest of a collector who tried to find a home for his or her books, his or her manuscripts. And that's the true history of scholarship in America. And you can think it's good or you can think it's bad. There are a lot of collectors who said, I want all my books sold at auction because I want my successors to have the pleasure that I had when I got to collect these books. But many others have said, I spent a lifetime doing this. I need to keep it together. Institutional consumption, that is to say, the buying of books by libraries, accounted for about 60% of the market in 1965. And currently accounts for about 15% in the current year. That's astonishing. So institutional buying has plummeted. But I think one has to say, in the interval between the First World War, ballpark, and about 1975, institutional buying dominated the market, especially in the 50s. And, well, 50s and 60s, really. The post-World War II era. Institutional buying dominated the market. That's not true anymore. And that means that the role of the collector and the scholar collector is going to become more and more important for preserving our cultural heritage, it seems to me. Between 1965 and the present day, the market value of books is approximately 10.5 times what it was. That has a profound impact on whether collectors sell or donate, as do tax regimes, of course, and that has a profound effect on institutional capabilities. So when we're thinking about the antiquarian market and how it figures, what is the sort of complex ecosystem, we have to think a little bit about carrying capacity. We have to think about what's possible as we think about the flows through the system. And those flows, if you will, those flows of value are conditioned first and foremost by that bottom line right there. 10.5 times what it was in 1965. So the ability of institutions to acquire has declined. But we all know that in the last 30 years in the United States of America, I'm ashamed to say, not just that the rich have gotten much, much richer, but we know that the poor have gotten much, much, much poorer in the last 30 to 35 years. That has nothing to do with the antiquarian book trade. Profoundly has something to do with who we are as a nation. But the top 2 to 5% of people have vastly grown richer. And there's your antiquarian book market for the high points, for good or ill. That's what's happened. So this just illustrates, this is a book that I've been working on for a while now. This is Samuel Johnson's Bible with his annotations. It was in R.S. Cotton's collection, then it went to an institution that came out because Mr. Scheide bought it, and then Donald and Mary Hyde acquired it, and then eventually it came into Harvard University quite famously. Remember that lockbox of things going, eventually they can cycle through, but eventually they hive off and the market has increasing scarcity. So I'd like to suggest that there's a kind of a golden triangle between the bookseller, the collector, and the library. And I'd like to look at what's the relationship between these as we think about how value is added and how things flow through the system. So a good case in point, really, to think about the new era of cooperation between them is this catalog, exhibition catalog that was produced by Texas A&M, an up-and-coming player in the field. Remarkable, an exhibition catalog. I wish to acknowledge the many booksellers who have helped us to build this collection over the past years, and they are named, ladies and gentlemen. Their expertise and discernment has been central in forming this collection. And then booksellers and libraries, in turn, depend upon collectors. And then they talk about collectors, and then they talk about other donors. This is the new reality. This is the new reality. That golden triangle of booksellers, librarians, and collectors all contributing to the flow of value, all contributing to the augmentation of what's there. There's a long history of this. Think about E.P. Goldschmidt and his catalogs and what he, as a book collector, added in terms of value. Here we see just an entry from his catalog. And this is just, I love the tone of this. I can see no argument whatever for placing this press at Paris, whereas the connection with Angers has been obvious to all bibliographers who have dealt with this type. And then he goes on and he explains, he transforms our understanding of the book. Graham Pollard said, "You know nothing about books until you've handled your first 5,000. Well, for a lot of us, that's pretty tough, but not for people in the trade. Not for people in the trade. And so it seems to me that often it's the people in the trade who know the most about the books, more than the scholars, far more than the scholars, and often more than the collectors, who are often busy earning the money. But if you're earning the money by working with the books, you can know a lot more. And that dynamic seems to me very important. Barry Rosenthal would be another case in point. We think of Steve Weissman as a contemporary example, or Bill Reese, or Roger Gaskell. These catalogs are important monuments of scholarship, it seems to me. But again, I think we should think about them as adding value to what exists. Not just monetary value, but adding cultural value, because they help us to understand and interpret the object. So it's also important to acknowledge at this point that important booksellers have been major collectors and major donors as well. The Rosenthal collection of printed books with manuscript annotations, 14th and 15th century books, some 16th century books, 160 of them. Now in the Beinecke Library, 160 major books with major annotations, resting at Yale safely. The Krauss collection of Sir Francis Drake, 69 items, including 19 manuscripts, 7 gorgeous medals in the Library of Congress. The collector is the scholar in many cases and is the interpreter. Rosenwald, of course, who made the most important bequest perhaps ever to the Library of Congress. The true collectors are those who purchase articles because they are vitally interested in them and they want to know as much as possible about them. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is what will be the history of collecting? Well, for one thing, why should people collect? I would put it in one word. Resonance. Resonance. When you bring multiples together, multiple things together, they begin to resonate. They begin to make a music. They begin to have a power and a beauty that they can never have as isolated examples. They begin to sing a song about themselves, which is discernible to those who attend carefully. And these things never do when they're isolated. They're important, but it's a very, very different thing. And I think that the future of collecting is going to move more and more away from high spots to what I would call comprehensive collecting. Comprehensive collecting so that this resonance can happen. And this is true with manuscripts as well as books. Ladies and gentlemen, for 11 years I had the profound privilege of being the curator of the Jared Manley Hopkins collection at Oxford University, housed in Campion Hall. It's how, for my sins, I ended up being the general editor of the collected works of Jared Manley Hopkins. But this is February 9th, 1868. This is what comprehensive collecting can do. Here is a diary entry of Jared Manley Hopkins. This is the whole entry. February 9th, fair in the morning with some frost, fine later. Thanks, Jer. But when we look at his correspondence, when we read his surviving letter written on the same day, I must say that I am very anxious to get away from this place. I've become very weak in health and do not seem to recover myself here or likely to do so. He's in Oxford. Teaching, oh no, he's just moved from Oxford, I apologize, to Birmingham. He's teaching for Newman in Newman's Birmingham Academy, the Oratory. Teaching is very burdensome, especially when you have much of it. I have not much time and almost no energy, for I am always tired to do anything on my own account. Same day, notebook. All words mean either things or relation of things. You may say also then substances or attributes or again wholes or parts, man or quarter. To every word meaning a thing and not a relation belongs a passion or prepossession or enthusiasm which it has the power of suggesting or producing, but not always in everyone. This not always refers to its evolution. He's evolving the theory of in-stress and inscape, the thing that he's most famous for. On the 9th of February, the day he feels lousy, it's cloudy outside, it's rainy. If you just had the weather report, you don't know anything. If you just had the letter to Bailey, you say, oh yeah, it's just lying around the house. If you just had this, you'd think he was Superman. Well, the truth is somewhere in between because there are these multiple textual voices. And when you have a collection and you put them in resonance with each other, they sing to you, they speak to you, they tell you the story of a very complex young man who's about to become one of the great artists of the Victorian period. But you can't get that without putting the three things together. And it seems to me this is the future of collecting. This is that resonance that I think is so central. You can't really know who Hopkins is unless you look at his drawings. Self-portrait reflected in a lake. I think that's incredible. Hopkins' brother was a professional illustrator. How can we understand Hopkins is so visual and so oral without understanding his drawings and his music? His musical compositions are lousy, but they're important. They're terrible. He doesn't understand counterpoint or the dam. But he's struggling with music all the time. We see in the Dublin Notebook, he's setting little Greek verses to music while he's grading exams because he's bored. Quite interesting, really. So what happens when you collect the first edition of Pope's Miscellanies with the second edition, and you see that it's really a reissue with some things added on? What's the bibliographical muscle there? The table of contents is the same, but contemporary people have said, oh, by the way, he added Windsor Forest. Oh, by the way, he added the Ode to Music. Oh, by the way, he added 3 new poems and 2 minor ones. What's up with that? Well, how would you know unless you had them together? How would you know that it's a reissue? You can't. So how can you know that Dryden and Pope, the new Pope, is being marketed as the new Dryden by being put in the same kind of wrappers, the same kind of labels? How can you know that unless you collect them? So there's a power, a resonance, if you will, that seems to me essential, and this comprehensive collecting is more and more going to be central to how we understand. And also, it seems to me, the genres that we're collecting are changing. right? The genre, what counts as collectible, what counts as a worthy enterprise for an institution or a collecting, like dime novels, Murder with Variety, Bewitched, okay, that these things were not collectible. They weren't worthy. But you know what? In the 18th century, the librarian of the Bodleian Library knew that no one would ever read contemporary English novels by crazy people like Daniel Defoe, by people like Henry Fielding, much less by those women novelists. So he knew that he could take them and give them to his family because they had nothing to do with the life of a university. Universities don't teach contemporary, well, it wasn't even thought of as literature, letters, we'll say. And so the Bodleian Library had to go and acquire all those 18th century novels because even though they got them from legal deposit, they weren't considered worthy. Well, now with the expanding canon, we're changing how we understand. So books, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me are complex objects. They're made out of bibliographical codes, and they're made out of linguistic codes, and they're made out of social codes. And you know this yourself. You know that when you go into the airport and you see something on the rack, and it's a small format book, and it's got those raised foil letters, and maybe like an AK-47 or a grenade, also in kind of a raised multicolor thing. You know what that book is. You don't ever have to read it. And if there's a man standing on the cover and he has no shirt on, maybe some baggy trousers, and he's holding a woman, and her dress is kind of falling off a little bit, and the plantation is burning in the background, right? You know what that book is, right? And if it's crimson, you know, if it's a crimson book cloth and it says in gold letters on the spine, Veritas, you know what that is. You know what that is, right? Because you can read the social codes, you can read the bibliographical codes, way beyond the linguistic codes. A book is an intentional object. It's the sum of many intentions. And it seems to me that bibliography has a great claim to be the most humanistic of all the disciplines. Because when you look closely at a book, each book is alive with the judgments of its makers. Because the design of every book in every aspect has designs upon you. I think there's a train coming through back here, but don't worry about it. I think we're all pretty safe. So how are we meant to understand the book as a complex object, not just the linguistic codes, which has been the traditional subject of study, but to say, no, we have to understand the book in its bibliographical codes and its social codes as well, because every book is an interpretation of the author. Every book is an interpretation of the readership. Every book is a complex sign system. Every book is a profoundly intentional object, or the sum of many intentions. You can't do that by looking at books in isolation. So one of the things that seems to me that we tried to do, Henry Woodhausen and I, in the Oxford Companion to the book, was we tried to pay a lot of attention to librarians and libraries, to collections, to name collections, and to collectors. The history of collectors and collecting is going to become more and more important to understanding our intellectual heritage, to understand how we got here and where we might go. If we don't bring in library history, and if we don't bring in the history of collectors and collecting, and if we don't begin to do the history of the antiquarian trade in the 20th century, which was so transformative for the intellectual institutions of this country, the culture of the United States has been transformed by that book market, by a complex ecosystem that I haven't even begun to do justice to today, but trying to tease out some of those relations, trying to tease out a little bit about the flow of value. But the book world's going to change because the float is so small. And remember, the book world is always existing in a condition of profound scarcity. And the good stuff is getting scarcer and scarcer. So what's going to happen? We're not just going to be looking at the history of the book in Britain. We're not just going to be looking at the history of the book in France and Germany and Switzerland and the Low Countries as we have. We're going to be more and more looking at the history of the book in China, the history of the book in maritime Southeast Asia. We're going to more and more, I think, be looking at the book globally. And you see that the leading cultural institutions now in the United States are moving more and more to making their collections authentically global. So Yale is collecting Southeast Asia like it's going out of style, right? And why? Because there's no point in collecting more Machiavelli for them. They've got it all. So what are they doing? They're collecting Southeast Asia because they say, hey, that's part of the future. Princeton is collecting China like it's not going to be there ever again. Because once they've got it, it won't. Right? So how is the book market changing? It's becoming much more global. It's becoming much more comprehensive. And sure, in that very high end, there's still a profound tendency toward high spots. But I think we're getting away from that more and more as plenty of those high spots end up in collections. So we're going to end up looking at different kind of book. We're going to end up looking at different kinds of artifacts. And that's going to be a profound challenge to the American book trade, it seems to me. But it's going to be part of globalization, good or ill. And I say good, because it'll allow us then to begin to do comparative work. And we don't have the knowledge to do comparative work about books right now, but we know that collectors and booksellers and public services people in libraries add value because they add knowledge. And so this will change. So what's the digital future? It's not a threat. People will try to mediate to us by virtual books, but people will always want to collect the artifact because there's always a relationship at the core of bibliography, which after all is a form of literacy. I'll say it again, bibliography is a form of literacy. It's learning how to read the object. And you can't read the object without having the artifact before you. The core of the antiquarian book trade down the line is going to be focused on having artifacts in collections, as it always has been. But it will be tied more and more to the essential enterprise of reading those artifacts in their pluriformity, in their complexity, precisely because the digital book can't do that for us. So A.W. Pollard tells us it was the zeal of private collectors that made the great libraries of the land. No library could have done what the collecting community has done. And we know that way back in the 1860s, John Hill Burton said that to make a collection is a splendid monument of enlightened exertion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. You know, this gentleman and I have never met before, and he has asked, how does one encourage the new generation of collectors? You send them to Rare Book School. I want to ask the gentleman a question. And you know, we've never met before, and I hope you won't be offended, okay? Do you love my sister Kathy? No, because you've never met her, right? Lest we get into legal problems. No, you can't love my sister Kathy because you don't know her. She's very lovable. She's married, not to worry. But she's very lovable, but you can't love her because you don't know her. And it's a fundamental canon of the humanistic enterprise that knowledge and love are inextricably linked. The more you know, the more you're able to love. But you never love something in the abstract. And so we're not going to get people to collect books because of the cod liver oil theory of collecting. It's good for you. It's good for society. So take this. That's not going to work. We have to make people excited and passionate about it because they have knowledge. And when they have knowledge, they can begin to love. And that means that we have to begin to teach people more and more bibliography and book history. And I can tell you, I had the perfect job, 9 months of the year, probably more like 8 months of the year at Oxford University, and about 4 months of the year at Fordham University in New York. I'm a native New Yorker. I did all my training at Oxford. I lived in the Bodleian Library. It was great. And I left that because of this question and questions like it. What's going to happen to the future of the book trade when so few young people, remember that market going up by 10.5 times, what's going to happen to the future of the book trade when so few young people can enter? What's going to happen to the future of collecting when it seems so few young people are doing it? What's going to happen in the future of bibliography and textual criticism when so few people are being taught it in the academy? So what I'm trying to do is I left my cushy job to go run Rare Book School because I think somebody better teach bibliographical literacy. I think somebody, and it's not Princeton because they don't offer a course in bibliography, and it's not University of Chicago, and it's not Berkeley, remarkably. And Harvard does teach 3 courses in book history, but they don't teach anything right now in technical bibliography. And it seems to me, how would you know how to read the object? How would you know what you were holding in your hands? Much less, there's nothing on the history of paper. Oh my God, you teach that in the academy? That's techne. No, it's not. It's history. It's history, and it's central to everything we do. So it seems to me that we have to rethink, and if we're going to be appropriate custodians of the past for the future, if we're going to pass on and interpret what's been given to us in trust for the next generations, then we have to arm those generations with knowledge, because it's only love that will drive them. It's not going to be some principle of what's good. It'll have to be the appeal of understanding and possessing and passing on those objects themselves. And that means the future of the past is in peril unless we teach people what they need to know to really love. And that seems to me at the core of the humanistic enterprise. That seems to me at the core of understanding books and manuscripts. So that's really what we're up against. And book dealers are great teachers. Many of the best collectors have learned through dealers. But it has to happen in the academy, and it has to happen in those other cultural institutions too. Why is the Library of Congress or the Newberry or the Folger not teaching bibliography? Not teaching book history with all those objects that are there? And it seems to me, the clock is ticking. So I have a profound sense of urgency about this, as if you couldn't tell. But I have a profound sense of urgency about this precisely because if we lose the current generation, what will happen? This will be kind of an arcane art. It'll be quaint. It'll be something for smelly old men in tweed coats. And that seems to me very dangerous. That seems to me very dangerous. Please.
I hate to mention the horror, but what about when there are, what about book collectors? What about when there are no more artifacts? What about, books in the 21st and 22nd century? There are no more.
Sure. What about when there are no more artifacts? See, as I try to suggest, however obliquely, I think that there are going to be plenty of artifacts. Although I think that the supply of the top end is limited, but I think the things we're going to collect are going to change. We're not going to be collecting just Moliere and Machiavelli. We're not just going to be collecting Chaucer, because there won't be any more Chaucer to collect. Well, I think that we're going to collect more globally, and I think that we're going to collect more comprehensively. So a good example would be Roger Chartier's beautiful article, not sufficiently well known, in which he asked the question, how did Moliere become the national playwright? How did Moliere become the national poet? And he began with the premise that none of his plays exist except in performance, which is evanescent, or in the physical objects that people read and interpreted. So he looked at 200 editions of Molière and watched him become the national playwright, watched him become set for schools, and watched him become set for universities, and so on and so on. Watched him become, a star in the heavens. And it's that kind of, nobody was collecting 19th century editions of Molière, but now we will,
The trend towards publishing electronically and
There is no artifact. What happens the day when no artifacts are produced? And I don't personally believe that that's happening.
yeah, I think, it's funny, I spoke on Tuesday at the Grolier Club in New York on digital books and the future of bibliographical knowledge. I don't think digital books are books at all. I don't think that the Library of Congress turning the pages is a good idea because it gives you the illusion that you're looking at a book where there is no materiality, there is no object, there's a picture of an object. And I think that there's no object. Well, there's a digital object, as Matt Kirschenbaum reminds us, but it's a different thing. I'm not worried about the digital future. I am not an either-or person. I'm a both-and. Here's what I would say in 2 seconds about the digital future. We're here because we love books. We're here because we're passionate about them. We can't prescind from the digital future. It's here. It will change the structures of knowledge. It will change the structures of the academy. We have to be present to it with all our knowledge and passion about books so that we have a place at the table. Because if we just say, oh, throw up our hands, that's dangerous, that's not me, that's scary, then we have no right to the conversation. I want to fight in for the conversation. I'll give you a good example. I got a phone call about 9 months ago. And it was somebody from Oxford University Press, and they said, Michael Suarez, yes. Well, we have a proposition for you, yes. We're going to digitize 700 scholarly editions, maybe 900. We're going to do the biggest digital humanities project in the world. We're going to take all our scholarly editions from Euripides and Socrates and the Dead Sea Scrolls right up onto Born Digital Things Now, and we're going to put them all on the web so they're fully searchable, full metadata, full markup. We're going to do this whole thing. And we want you to be in charge. And I said, no. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, no, you got the wrong guy. I'm not a digital humanities guy. I'm a bibliographer. I'm a book historian. I'm a textual critic. And there was this long pause on the line, and they said, we know. We know who you are. Do you think that we would be calling you and asking you to be in charge of a 12-year, multi-million-pound project if we hadn't read your CV? We know that you're a traditionally, classically trained scholar. And that's why you have to be in charge, because the digital people will mess it up. And I thought, oh, we could have a conversation now. But see, I think that the book people have to be at the table with the digital folks, because otherwise we have nothing to say. So I'll dance with the devil if it'll advance the cause of books and manuscripts. I will. I'll be anywhere because this is important. There has to be a future for books. There has to be a future for our heritage. And it's not in the Kindle. But the digital world's not the enemy. It can do all sorts of good things for us. And so it's a both and, not an either or. But for me, I don't want the technology to run my thinking or to run my life. I want to run the digital technology. Do you see the difference? And unless we think creatively and capaciously, and unless we are critical in the Greek sense of the word, the critic is the person who sits in the seat of judgment. So unless we bring a critical perspective to these things, if we just sort of have either condemnation or unbridled enthusiasm, we make ourselves dumber than we are. But if we come with a critical perspective and a capacious perspective, then it seems to me that we can embrace the future cautiously but judiciously. And it's that judiciousness that's called for. It's a kind of, if you will, Aristotelian prudential judgment that we have to bring to this. Not a, oh, this is wonderful, everything's perfect. But nor we condemn this, anathema sit. We're not going to do that either. So it's a both and, it seems to me. Sir?
You've been wonderfully scrupulous in talking about this flow of value, in assuming that the value of the marketplace and the value of the academy, scholarship, money and knowledge, have equal roles to play. But for both collectors and institutions, those roles differ. And isn't there a threshold debate about a hierarchy of ideal values, not a level playing field of all values or of equal value?
That is very perspicacious. Did everybody hear the question? You know, is there really a kind of equivalence between intellectual value and market value? No. No, of course not. And one of the very interesting things about the individual collector versus the institutional representative is that the individual collector is not constrained by policy or by bosses in the way that the institutional collector is. And the constraints on institutions right now are disheartening. And I'll give you an example. I know a book dealer who told me that he was trying to sell a book to a major collection. This was at the New York Fair we were discussing this. Trying to sell a major book to an important book to a major collection. And it was entirely consonant with their acquisitions program, with their holdings, and all the rest. And the curator wanted to buy the book, yeah. And the higher-ups said, there's a copy of this book somewhere else in the state, and therefore, no. Well, that's mad, of course, because if you're going to read the object, if you're going to have that resonance, right, you have to have them on the table together, right? Well, and then the response came back, you could just take digital pictures. Well, you can't just take digital pictures. That's a different lecture. That's the lecture I gave on Tuesday night at the Grolier Club, but that's a different thing. And digital pictures aren't books. Digital pictures are not artifacts. And what we have to learn how to do is to read objects, because the objects are signaling or signifying to us all the time. If only we would develop the literacies to let them speak to us. And so no, ultimately, since we're talking about a marketplace, in any of these aspects, there are economic determinants that trump everything else. And it's important to recognize that. Economic determinants ultimately trump everything. And that's you know, you could have all the ideals you want. If your children are starving, you'll publish any political pamphlet you have to feed your kids. So the idea that all the publishers in the French Revolution had a particular ideology that they were supporting because, you know, they were indifferent to filthy lucre. I don't think so. You know, follow the money. Book selling's a business. I tell my students all the time, if you want to do the history of books, follow the money, because that's the first flow of value. So when we're talking about flows, we have to look at the flow of money as one of the forms of value, not the only form of value. Remember that we're talking partly here, as people like Bourdieu and others remind us, we're talking about the flow of cultural capital, as well as the flow. Why would somebody spend $8 million last year on a copy of the Declaration of Independence? I can call it up in Wikipedia. Well, why would you spend $8 million on a copy of the Declaration of Independence? Because it has iconic value, because it has totemic value, because it signifies more than its linguistic codes. An extreme example, I'm willing to admit. But sure, economic determinants are hugely important. Please.
I just want to be optimistic, if I may. Part of my life is publishing books where you learn how to print, you learn how to make paper, you learn how to do things. I have a fest where we gather these kind of people together. And I'll tell you, there is an unbelievable amount of young people out there wanting to make books. More and more of these book art programs all over the country. And if that isn't optimistic, I don't know what is.
One of the things that we're trying to do at Rare Book School, and I'm hoping to have this on board in the summer of 2012, I'm really worried that a 15-year-old's relation to the book is very different from our relation to the book when we were growing up, and I'm worried about losing that generation. So we're starting a program where we will teach high school social studies teachers. We will teach high school English teachers. We will teach high school librarians. And we'll give them scholarships to come. We'll teach them about the history of American print culture. And we'll help them to develop curricular materials which they will make available in the public domain. And we'll help bankroll that. Because if we lose those 15 and 16-year-olds, then Bob's not going to have anybody come to his fest in 20 years. And so, yeah, exactly. So what we need to do is we need to get people excited, and we're going to begin to do that by talking about the role of print culture in the colonial and federalist period. We'll talk about the role of print culture in abolition, talk about the role of print culture in the American Civil War and in Reconstruction, and to get people excited about how print is an engine of politics, how print is an engine of ideas. And that will begin to get people interested in the physical artifact. So one of the things that I'm captivated by, for example, is if you look at the dissemination of Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, I've counted it appears in something like 22 different forms. And it's just a presidential inaugural address. Different newspapers, pamphlets, scarves that women wore. It's printed on silk, it's printed on cotton, it's printed in broadsides, it's printed in small pamphlets. Why? Because the marketplace is prodigal, and the marketplace is stratified. And buying a little 16-mo version is very, very different than buying it printed on a silk scarf. Thank you very much. Markets are always stratified. And the problem is survival rates are differential, of course. And so a lot of the stuff doesn't survive. But it seems to me when we look at the propagation of ideas through print, we could be onto something very powerful. And that could give people a new view. But notice that we'll make those things available in part. We'll make facsimiles, we'll do a lot of hard work. But we'll make a lot of this material available to anybody who wants it through the World Wide Web, which last time I checked is digital and electronic, and not the enemy, but our friend if we co-opt it for our good purposes.
One comment reflective of the paucity of high spots today. This very individual who appeared, John Hill, very said that paraphrase that to him the greatest collector was a person who saw value when others only see piles of rubbish.
Right. And we're going to expand our notion of value over time, it seems to me. And that's partly how we're going to address this question of the scarcity of material. Yeah. I have kept you long. I have schedules for the Rare Book School that I would be happy to distribute to those who would like to come get them. I'd love to meet you and speak with you individually. Thank you so much for your time and attention.